Halton Hills.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'll be splitting my time with the member for Niagara West. Madam Speaker, I'd like to quote a fiscal conservative. Quote, Canadians want to know that the principles guiding government are the ones that they share. Here are our principles. First, governments created the deficit burden, and so governments must resolve it by focusing first in their own backyards, by getting spending down, not by putting taxes up. Second, our fiscal strategy will be worth noting if at the end of the day we have not provided hope. Well, our fiscal strategy will be worth nothing if at the end of the day we have not provided hope for jobs and for growth. We must focus on getting growth up at the same time as we strive to get spending down. Third, we must be frugal in everything we do. Waste in government is simply not tolerable. Fourth, we must forever put aside the old notion that new government programs require additional spending. They don't. What they do require is the will to shut down what doesn't work and focus on what can. That is why a central thrust of our effort is reallocation. Whether on the spending side or on the revenue side, every initiative in this budget reflects a shift from lower to higher priority areas. Finally, we must always be fair and compassionate. It is the most vulnerable whose voices are often the least strong. We must never let the need to become frugal become an excuse to stop being fair. End of quote. Madam Speaker, that was Finance Minister Paul Martin in his 1996 budget speech. Mr. Martin understood how to create jobs and growth. It was to focus on growth at the same time as getting spending down and not putting taxes up. It was to forever put aside the old notion that new government programs required additional spending. Madam Speaker, this budget in front of the House today does the opposite. The budget increases taxes. It increases spending and spends on consumption rather than on investment. And this is an approach the government has taken since it formed government in 2015. And it is not working. In fact, the government admits to this in its own budget. On page 25 of the budget document, there's a chart that's titled Average Potential Annual Growth in Real GDP Per Capita, Selected OECD Countries 2020 to 2060. In this chart, Canada is dead last. This chart is an indictment of the economic policies of this government over the last 6 years. And while the budget pays lip service to jobs and growth, it does not have a credible plan to create jobs and growth. In fact, here's what the CEO of RBC said recently about the government's economic policies, one of the largest private sector employers in Canada. Here's what he said about this government's plan, David McKay. Quote, tax and spend to me is like eating sugar pops for breakfast. You feel really good for an hour, and you feel crappy by noon at the end of the day. And that's what tax and spend gives you. It doesn't give you sustainable prosperity. End of quote. The budget increases taxes. In fact, it levies a new tax on significant financial institutions, one of the few sectors of growth in the Canadian economy in recent years. The budget increases government spending. It calls for more than $56 billion in new spending over the next 6 years. And that comes on top of additional spending that was just announced in last fall's economic update. And that in turn comes on top of additional spending that was announced in last year's budget. In fact, the government is now spending fully $70 billion a year more than it did before the pandemic hit. That's more than 3% of GDP. That is an incredible increase in government spending. But despite all this new spending, the government isn't allocating spending in the right places. For example, the spending doesn't reflect the need to strengthen Canada's defence and security and the need to uphold our international commitments. All of this new spending announced in this budget, in the last fall economic update, and in last year's budget isn't going to the Canadian military. First off, Madam Speaker, a big problem with the budget documents in terms of transparency to Parliament, the government is proposing two very different and contradictory figures for military spending in the budget documents. One number it proposes is an additional $8 billion over the next 5 years, but elsewhere in the budget, it proposes an additional $23 billion over the next 3 years. And these numbers are not fully accounted for. But set aside the two different figures in the budget for military spending. Even if you take the most optimistic scenario that the government has laid out in the budget, it still doesn't meet Canada's international NATO commitments. Madam Speaker, the world changed on February 24th. Russia attacked Ukraine, beginning the first war between states in Europe since 1945. In doing so, autocratic states like Russia have made it clear that they are prepared to attack democracies abroad and here at home. Other governments have realized the world has changed. That's why on February 27th, Germany did a U-turn on decades of foreign and military policy. Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who heads a center-left coalition, announced that Germany would begin immediately increasing defense spending to meet and exceed the 2% NATO commitment, beginning with an immediate infusion of $140 billion Canadian in new military spending. The German government understands that the world has changed, Madam Speaker. This Liberal government does not. NATO members have had a long-standing commitment to spend 2% of gross domestic product on the military. As I've just mentioned, Germany will be meeting that commitment. Canada's closest allies already exceed that commitment, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. Canada does not, and the budget contains no measures for us to meet that NATO commitment. In fact, on the latest NATO data, Canada ranks 25th out of 29 member states of NATO in terms of our contribution to our defense and security. That wasn't always the case, Madam Speaker. Canada was once a leading contributor to the alliance. More than 1.1 million Canadians served in the Second World War, and over 40,000 paid the ultimate sacrifice and gave their lives in defense of this country. And for decades, throughout the 1980s and well into the early 1990s, Canada exceeded the 2% commitment. Canada spent more than 2% of its gross domestic product on defense. And here's why that lack of defense spending should concern us all. There is no greater guarantee of peace and security in this world than military strength. In fact, before 1945 in North America, both Canada and the United States had no standing militaries of any scale to deter aggression. And in the century before 1945, our histories were replete with bloody and costly wars that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of our citizens in defense of democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. And that is why, since 1945, we have pledged to never again go through that horrific period in history. And as we agreed to establish standing militaries of sufficient size to deter the aggression that we are seeing around the world, and potentially the aggression we might see in the Indo-Pacific region. Madam Speaker, the greatest guarantor of peace and security is a strong and robust military. And because the government isn't allocating enough spending to Canada's military, it is leaving Canada exposed and vulnerable in a violent and unstable world. Madam Speaker, as Mr. Martin understood almost 3 decades ago, the budget should create jobs and growth by getting spending down and not by getting taxes up, by forever putting aside the old notion that new government programs require additional spending. And what spending does take place should take the form of investment rather than consumption. This government, though, has forgot the lessons of the 1990s. Taxes and spending are up New programs have not come from reallocation, but from additional spending, and this spending is in the form of consumption rather than investment. And despite all this additional spending, this government's budget does not uphold our NATO defence spending commitment, as outlined in the Wales Summit Declaration of 2014. And for all those reasons, Madam Speaker, I cannot support this budget.
Comments? The Honourable